Okay, so I mentioned earlier that, a lot of people object to Freud sort of sexualizing childhood. I don't know where they get the idea that he sexualizes childhood when we look at this name of this model here, his psychosexual stages. He definitely talks about things with regard to children that a lot of people feel uncomfortable with. But what he's talking about here is where our libido and thanatos are being placed at different stages of development. He thought that these things were tied to biological development. So he said between the ages of 0 and 18 months, we're all in the oral stage. And that sucking, biting, and chewing are really important behaviors during this stage. It's all about how you use your mouth to achieve your goals. And one of the things that really characterizes people who are in this stage is that they're very dependent. I mean, if you think about an infant who's 0 to 18 months, they get fed when the environment wants to feed them. They get moved when the environment wants to move them, right? I mean, they're completely dependent on their environment. So they use sucking, biting, and chewing as a way not only to get nutrition, but also to interact with the world. If you give a 9-month-old anything, put it in their hand, it'll immediately go in their mouth to explore it. And so I don't think we can really deny that there's a lot of information being gathered through the mouth, nutrition being gained through the mouth. Where it becomes a little bit different from Freud's perspective than from what I'm kind of implying is that he thought that there was a certain amount of psychic satisfaction that comes from using your mouth in these ways to explore the world, and that you're getting information that feeds your id in really important ways. So that babies who are allowed to suck, bite, and chew at will sort of have their needs being met at a level that children who are not allowed to do that, like babies who are withheld feeding, if you have a baby who's on a 4-hour cycle of being fed and their mom or dad does not believe in pacifiers, so they're not allowed to suck whenever they want. So they're not getting fed whenever they want, and they can't just suck on a pacifier in between. Freud would say that that's denying their need to suck at will during a time of their lives when he thought it was really important that they have sort of their ability to express that. So, okay, so oral stage is not that objectionable, so let's move on. How about the anal stage? Okay, we all have to just appreciate the name of it, because, I mean, come on, is he trying to make people irritated with this stuff? But he called it the anal stage. He said most kids between about 18 and 36 months are really bogged down in this. And he thought it all surrounded bowel and bladder elimination, because he thought it was all about gaining control over ourselves. That once you've gotten control of bowel and bladder elimination, stuff like that, that's step one in gaining control over other aspects of yourself and your environment. So he thought that learning to control was a really big, important factor in the anal stage. And the big crisis, I guess you might say, that children are facing during this stage is potty training. Being encouraged to get control over themselves on the time scale that the parents value. Right? So whereas oral stage is all about, getting weaned as a big important crisis, the anal stage is about getting potty trained. Okay, so our next stage is called the phallic stage. Phallic is, sort of a euphemistic term for penis. And so yeah, we're getting more and more objectionable as we go along, right? So now here we are between the ages of 3 and 6, and he thought that this was the time when kids really develop their gender identity. He thought that little boys look down and see their penis and think, yay, I'm one of the chosen ones, I'm going to be powerful in life, and all good things will come to me because I'm male. Whereas he thought little girls looked down and saw their lack of penis as evidence that they must have done something really heinously wrong that they don't remember having done, that resulted in them getting castrated, their penis and testicles removed. So he thought that girls start off their gender identity with a sense of shame and guilt, and that boys start off their gender identity with a sense of pride. All right, nothing objectionable here. This is all looking really good, right? We're all on board. Okay, slightly objectionable, obviously. Just reporting what Freud said. We're not going to make judgments. All right. Now, he said that children during the phallic stage that boys during the phallic stage enter what he calls the Oedipus complex or Oedipus conflict. There's different adjectives there to describe that, but complex or conflict, depending on how you want to say it. The key word there is Oedipus. I don't know how many of you guys have read Oedipus the King or Oedipus Rex. It's been made into movies and plays and stuff like that too. I know a lot of AP English classes involve lessons on Oedipus the King. For all of you who missed it, I will give you the super deluxe truncated version with only that stuff that pertains to what we're talking about here. So the king and queen of a kingdom in Greece gave birth to a baby boy. And the soothsayer came and looked at the baby boy and said, "This child is going to grow up to murder his father and marry his mother." So the parents are horrified. So they put the baby in a field to die of the elements. And the sheep herder, who is following his flock in the field, comes upon this baby. He and his wife had been unable to have any children, so he was like, "The gods have left us a child." So he takes the baby back home and says, "Mother, mother, the gods have left us a child." And they name him Oedipus, and they raise him as their own. One day, Oedipus is in town, and he bumps into the soothsayer. Oedipus is like 18 by this time, or of adult status in their culture at that time. And the soothsayer looks at the young man, and he says, "You are going to murder your father and marry your mother." And so the little young Oedipus was like, I don't want to murder the sheep herder and marry the sheep herder's wife, right? So he goes on a big quest, and he has a bunch of misadventures that are actually quite entertaining if you have time to read this over the break. Because, after you have your day of sleeping in, you need something to read. It's actually not that long of a story. Anyway, point is, goes on this big adventure, yada yada, but stuff happens. He comes into contact with the king, which is his father, and they have a challenge, and Oedipus ends up winning the challenge, which ends in the king's death. And the prize for winning the challenge is you get to be married to the queen of the kingdom. So he marries the queen, his mother, and then here comes the soothsayer that says the prophecy is complete, and now everybody has to plunge off the balcony and poke their eyes out, and all sorts of bad stuff happens. Okay, so obviously Freud had read this Greek tragedy, and he said, this explains a lot of the stories that I hear from my patients. Now remember, back in the last segment I talked about how Freud came up with all of these theories from his disordered patients. So he reports that he heard from a lot of his patients that they had sort of possessive feelings towards their opposite-sex parents, that they were jealous of their same-sex parents for having, this relationship with the opposite-sex parent. Now I'm going to focus on boys, because boys are really explained by the Oedipus complex. Boys are like Oedipus, according to Freud. They fall in love with their mothers and want to eliminate their fathers as rivals. And so between the ages of 3 and 6, you see little boys giving their dads the cold shoulder. When it's time to sit down, the little boy always wants to sit by mom. If mom and dad sit next to each other, the little boy will go wedge himself between the two of them. The little boy wants to hold mom's hand all the time and doesn't ever want to hold dad's hand. Things like this, trying to give dad the cold shoulder. Of course, dad, he's clueless. He's not getting the hint here at all. And so the little boy starts thinking, well, I'm going to have to escalate this. Now, of course, remember, this is all thought to be going on unconsciously. This is an id impulse. So this is going on unconsciously. So the little boy, his id's trying to figure out how he's going to achieve his goal of getting rid of dad, and starts hatching like murder plots. But the murder plots always end in the little boy's mind with the dad being bigger, stronger, and ending up winning. And so the little boy never acts on any of his murder plots because he thinks he'll lose. And then he starts to worry, if my dad finds out I've been thinking these mean, bad thoughts about him, he's going to retaliate, and because he's going to be really mad. And the worst thing Freud says that a little boy can conceive of is being castrated and ending up without his penis. So little boys start to develop castration anxiety. They start to worry that dad is going to find out about all the animosity that the little boy's been carrying around, and dad is going to retaliate with castration. So Now the little boy has to decide, what am I going to do about this? Well, at this point, Freud says that most little boys will end up repressing, forgetting about permanently is what repression means, goes off into the unconscious. So you repress the lust that you've been having for your mom, and you repress the animosity that you've been carrying towards your dad, and act like none of that ever happened. And instead, you shift all your psychic energy over to identifying with your dad. And this is how gender identity completes itself, according to Freud, is once you realize, I want to be like dad as a little boy, you say to yourself, I want to be like dad, so that one day I can attract a woman like mom for myself. And that's how we resolve the Oedipal conflict and end up identifying with our same-sex gender. Now, Freud tried to do this with girls, too, and he called it the Electra complex. But he kept running up against a brick wall. If you'll recall, a few minutes ago I mentioned that Freud thought that when little girls looked down and saw their lack of penis, that they concluded they'd already been castrated. So he never could figure out what prevents little girls from just trying to murder their mothers. And so he pretty much just gave up on his Electra complex. Some of his followers tried to sort of tie it up in a neat bow, saying that, well, they never fully repress the animosity that they hold towards their mom and the lust that they have towards their fathers, so that even as adults, women grow up to feel too close to their dads. Like they never fully completely rely on their husband's judgment and stuff. They'll still ask their dad's judgment instead. They never fully repress their animosity towards their moms, and so they're always in competition. There's like this jealousy thing. Freud didn't necessarily agree with that, but some of his followers thought that was a decent way to balance it out. The point is that the way that gender identity gets resolved in the end is by identifying with your same-sex parent, according to Freud. Okay, so now our next stage is a little less exciting. Between 6 years and puberty, we're in the latent stage. And in the latent stage, instead of attaching our libido and our thanatos to a body part, like your mouth or your bowel bladder or your genitals, instead you attach all your psychic energy outward to social demands, making same-sex friends, doing well in school. Because what's going on between 6 years and puberty for most kids is that they're in school and they're making a lot of friends. And so the latent period, the psychic energy was directed outwards rather than attached to a body part. Finally, when you reach puberty, according to Freud, you develop mature sexual interests. This is what he called the genital phase, because he said during the genital phase, you start to get interested in using your genitals for what they were designed, which is reproduction. I put wedding rings as the picture depicting it, because he literally thought that your job after puberty was to find a mate and make children. And that's really what the function is. So you can kind of see that he still has that doctor, very medical approach to psychological development, because he thinks that once you can make children, that's your overriding motivator, at least at the unconscious level, that you're going to try and find a mate and make babies. Okay. This leads us to the discussion of fixation. And I'm going to save this for our next segment, but I'll just point out that he thinks sometimes we can get fixated at earlier stages of development. So let's save that for the next segment.